That butterfly is going to get crushed in a real war, sweetheart. The words cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and cold, delivered with the kind of cruelty that only comes from someone who's never been tested. Blake Harrison stood over the fallen figure in the mud, his boots planted wide, his smile predatory. Around him, a dozen other recruits formed a loose circle, some laughing, others just watching with the vacant stare of sheep following their shepherd. Casey Brennan lay where she'd been shoved, her uniform now caked with the thick brown sludge of the training yard. The torn fabric of her sleeve revealed what Blake had been waiting to see, what he'd been hunting for since she'd arrived at Fort Davidson 3 days ago. The butterfly tattoo traced elegant lines down her left collarbone, its wings spread wide in black ink that seemed to shimmer even through the mud. She didn't scramble to get up, didn't curse or cry, or do any of the things they expected. Instead, she rose with a fluid motion that was almost graceful, brushing the worst of the dirt from her knees with hands that barely trembled. Her eyes, when she looked up at Blake, held something that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not fear, not anger, something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. "You done?" she asked, her voice so quiet that the morning breeze nearly swallowed it. Blake recovered quickly, puffing out his chest like a rooster in a henhouse. "Done, princess. I'm just getting started. See that pretty little decoration you got there?" He gestured at her collarbone with mock reverence. "That might fly at whatever art school you crawled out of, but this is the real world. This is where warriors are made, not where little girls come to play dress-up." The laughter that followed was harsh and braying, the sound of pack animals sensing weakness. Casey stood perfectly still in the center of it, letting it wash over her like rain. Her fingers moved unconsciously to her collarbone, tracing the butterfly's wing with a gesture so automatic it seemed like breathing. What none of them saw was the way her thumb found the tiny scar at the butterfly's head, a mark so small it could have been a flaw in the tattoo work. What none of them knew was that the butterfly wasn't decoration. It was a memorial for 6 men who died screaming her name in a place that didn't officially exist, during an operation that had never happened. The tank maintenance bay hummed with the sound of diesel engines and hydraulic systems, a mechanical symphony that had become Casey's favorite soundtrack since arriving at Fort Davidson. While the other recruits groaned about grease under their fingernails and the complexity of the M1A2 Abrams systems, she moved through the massive machine like she'd been born inside its steel belly. Drill Sergeant Wade Murphy watched her from across the bay, his weathered face set in its perpetual scowl. 23 years of breaking down recruits and building up soldiers had given him an eye for potential, and what he saw in Casey Brennan made him deeply uncomfortable. Not because she was bad at the work, but because she was too good. "Brennan!" His voice boomed across the maintenance bay, causing several recruits to jump. Casey didn't even flinch. "Front and center now." She slid out from under the tank's massive chassis with the same fluid grace she'd shown in the mud, wiping her hands on a rag that was already beyond salvation. Her uniform was regulation perfect, despite the grease stains, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. The butterfly tattoo peeked out from her collar like a secret trying to escape. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." Murphy circled her like a shark, his boots clicking against the concrete floor. "You just completed a full diagnostic on that Abrams in 47 minutes. The manual says it should take a minimum of 2 hours for a qualified mechanic. You want to explain that to me, recruit?" Around them, the maintenance bay had gone quiet. Wrenches stopped turning. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Blake Harrison, who'd been loudly complaining about a stuck bolt, craned his neck to watch the show. Casey's expression didn't change. I followed the manual, Drill Sergeant. Perhaps I read faster than average. A few snickers rippled through the watching recruits. Murphy's eyes narrowed to slits. Reading faster, right? And I suppose that explains how you knew to check the turret drive motor without consulting the troubleshooting flowchart, or how you identified that hydraulic leak by sound alone from 30 feet away. The questions hung in the air like accusations. Casey felt the weight of 24 stares, felt the hostility radiating from Blake Harrison's corner of the bay, where he stood with his usual crew of followers. She could give Murphy the truth, could tell him about the 18 months she'd spent keeping Abrams tanks running in conditions that would make this climate-controlled bay seem like paradise. She could explain that the sound of a failing hydraulic line was burned into her memory, along with a dozen other mechanical signatures that meant the difference between mission success and body bags. Instead, she said, "Lucky guess, Drill Sergeant." Murphy stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing tobacco. Finally, he nodded toward the tank. "Lucky guess, right? Well, let's see how lucky you are when that tank needs to pass combat readiness inspection in 6 hours. Any mistakes come back on your head, Brennan. Remember that." As he stalked away, the whispers started, not the cruel laughter from the morning's incident, but something more insidious. Doubt, suspicion, the kind of talk that followed soldiers who seemed too prepared, too skilled, too ready for things they shouldn't know how to handle. Blake Harrison pushed off from the tool rack where he'd been leaning, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the face of this new opportunity. "Beginner's luck," he announced to anyone within earshot. That's all it was. Give her something really challenging and watch her fall apart like wet tissue paper. But Austin Rodriguez, who'd been working on the tank next to Casey's, had seen something the others missed. He'd seen her hands move with absolute certainty as she'd navigated the Abrams complex systems. He'd seen her pause at exactly the right moments, listening to mechanical sounds that meant nothing to him, but clearly spoke volumes to her. Most importantly, he'd seen the way her fingers had automatically found the butterfly tattoo when Murphy started asking questions, like she was drawing strength from something they couldn't see. The storm that would define the next phase of Casey's time at Fort Davidson was already building on the horizon, dark clouds gathering in the form of whispered conversations and suspicious glances. But for now, she simply turned back to her work, disappearing once again beneath the steel belly of the machine, leaving only the sound of precise, expert movements and the faint outline of butterfly wings visible in the shadows. 3 days later, the weather turned ugly in the way that only military training exercises could appreciate. Rain fell in sheets across the obstacle course, turning the already challenging terrain into a nightmare of mud, standing water, and treacherous footing. The kind of conditions that separated the committed from the casual, the warriors from the weekend adventurers. Casey stood at the starting line with 11 other recruits, her uniform already soaked despite the waterproof poncho that hung uselessly from her shoulders. The butterfly tattoo was completely hidden beneath layers of wet fabric, but she could feel its weight anyway, pressing against her collarbone like a reminder of promises made and prices paid. "Listen up, maggots!" Drill Sergeant Murphy's voice cut through the sound of rain hammering against metal obstacles. "This course is designed to break you. It's designed to find every weakness, every shortcut you've ever taken, every lie you've told yourself about being tough enough for this job. Half of you will fail. The other half will wish you had." Blake Harrison stood 3 positions down the line, his earlier bravado somewhat dampened by the conditions, but still intact. He caught Casey's eye and mouthed a single word: "Princess." The smile that accompanied it promised that her earlier luck in the maintenance bay wouldn't save her here. The starting whistle screamed across the training ground, barely audible above the storm. Casey launched herself forward with the others, her boots finding purchase on surfaces that seemed determined to send her sprawling. The first obstacle was a rope climb over a wall that had become a waterfall. The rope itself slick and treacherous. She watched two recruits ahead of her lose their grip and crash back to the starting platform before pulling herself up with movements that were economical and precise. Austin Rodriguez had positioned himself near the middle of the pack, but his attention wasn't on his own performance. He was watching Casey navigate the course with the same uncomfortable precision she'd shown in the maintenance bay. When they reached the navigation segment, where recruits were supposed to use compass and map to find a series of checkpoints in the driving rain, Casey barely glanced at her compass before striking out into the storm. She moved through this course like she'd memorized it, taking routes that seemed random, but somehow always led to the fastest times. When visibility dropped to less than 10 yards in the worst of the rain, she adjusted her pace but never her direction. When the ground turned from mud to standing water, to something that was more swamp than terrain, her footing remained sure while others floundered. But it was at the 7th checkpoint, hidden behind a cluster of concrete barriers designed to simulate urban warfare conditions, that Austin saw something that made his blood run cold. As they approached the obstacle, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors cut through the rain. Training exercise noise, nothing more. But Casey's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying in its perfection. She hit the ground in a defensive position so smoothly it looked choreographed, her body finding cover behind the concrete barriers with the kind of muscle memory that only came from real combat. She was back on her feet before anyone else had even processed what they'd heard. But Austin had seen enough. The way she'd moved wasn't something you learned in basic training. It wasn't something you picked up from manuals or simulator time. It was something you developed when helicopter sounds meant incoming fire and the wrong reaction meant death. By the time they reached the final obstacle, Casey had built a lead that should have been impossible for someone of her supposed experience level. The wall climb at the course's end was a beast of engineering. 30 feet of smooth concrete with only small handholds and a rope that felt like it had been greased for maximum difficulty. In the rain, it became an exercise in controlled falling as much as climbing. Blake Harrison reached the wall just as Casey was making her final approach to the top. Frustration and humiliation had been building in him all morning, watching her performance with growing disbelief and rage. As she passed within arm's reach, he made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. The rope she was using to stabilize her climb developed a sudden, mysterious fray. The handhold she'd been reaching for became mysteriously slippery. What should have been a clean finish to an impressive performance became a 20-foot fall into mud that was deep enough to break bones. Casey hit the ground with an impact that drove the air from her lungs and sent mud flying in all directions. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, and Austin felt his heart stop. Then she rolled to her feet with that same fluid grace, checking herself for injuries with hands that moved like they'd done this before. No broken bones, no serious damage, just mud and frustration, and the growing certainty that her accident hadn't been an accident at all. Blake Harrison completed his own climb moments later, his expression carefully neutral as he joined the small crowd gathered around Casey. "Tough break, Princess," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe next time you should focus on staying on the rope instead of showing off." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Casey looked up at him through the rain, her eyes holding that same dangerous calm they'd shown in the maintenance bay. She didn't deny the showboating charge, didn't defend herself or make excuses. Instead, she stood up, brushed the worst of the mud from her uniform, and walked back to the starting line. "I'd like to run the course again, Drill Sergeant," she announced to Murphy, who'd been watching the entire spectacle with growing concern. Murphy looked at her like she'd suggested they all go for a picnic. "Brennan, You just fell 30 feet. You should be in the medical tent, not asking for seconds. I'm fine, Drill Sergeant. I'd like to run it again. Something in her tone made the other recruits step back. Blake Harrison's smile faltered slightly as he realized he might have pushed the wrong person too far. But it was too late to back down now. Too late to pretend he hadn't sabotaged her equipment, or that everyone hadn't seen him do it. Casey ran the course again in conditions that had somehow gotten worse while they'd been talking. This time, she completed it in a time that broke the facility record by 47 seconds. She did it without using the rope Blake had tampered with, scaling the final wall with handholds alone, in a display of upper body strength that left the watching drill sergeant speechless. When she reached the top, she looked down at Blake Harrison and said, "Just loud enough for him to hear. Lucky guess, right?" But even as she stood triumphant at the course's highest point, Casey could feel the web of suspicion and hostility tightening around her. Every skilled performance, every display of unusual competence, every moment where her training showed through the careful facade she'd constructed was another nail in the coffin of her cover story. She was supposed to be a civilian transfer with an art background. She was supposed to be learning these skills for the first time, supposed to be struggling with the basics like any normal recruit. Instead, she was dominating every challenge put in front of her, and people were starting to ask questions she couldn't answer without blowing an operation that had taken months to set up. The butterfly tattoo pressed against her collarbone as she climbed down from the wall, its weight a constant reminder of the men who died because someone had leaked information about their mission. Someone in the military chain of command had sold them out, had sent them into an ambush that should have killed all of them. She'd survived, but barely, and only because she'd been willing to sacrifice everything, including her military career, to get her people home. Now she was back, hunting the same enemy that had nearly killed her team, and they were starting to hunt her in return. The briefing room at Fort Davidson smelled of stale coffee and frustration when Casey arrived for what everyone knew would be her final evaluation. 2 weeks of escalating suspicion and increasingly difficult tests had led to this moment, where her continued presence in the training program would either be confirmed or terminated. Instructor Logan Price sat behind a metal desk that had seen better decades. Her personnel file spread open in front of him, like evidence in a criminal trial. His expression was the kind of cold professionalism that preceded career-ending conversations, and Casey recognized it immediately. She'd seen that look before on the faces of officers who'd had to make impossible decisions about soldiers under their command. "Sit down, Brennan." She took the metal chair across from him, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap with military precision that she immediately regretted showing. Price noticed. Of course, he noticed everything. "Let's talk about your performance," Price began, flipping through pages of evaluation reports. "Tank maintenance, perfect scores across the board. Obstacle course, facility records in multiple categories. Weapons qualification, expert marksman on first attempt. Navigation, 98% accuracy in conditions that challenged seasoned veterans." Each accomplishment landed like an accusation. Casey remained silent, knowing that anything she said would only make her situation worse. Price looked up from the file, his eyes holding the cold calculation of a man who'd spent years separating truth from lies. "You want to explain to me how someone with no military background achieves performance levels that most of our instructors would envy?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could destroy everything Casey had worked for. She could feel the butterfly tattoo against her collarbone, could almost hear the voices of the men who died trusting her to keep them safe. Their sacrifice had bought her this chance to find their killer, and she wasn't about to waste it on pride or the need to defend herself against accusations. "I study hard, sir. I pay attention to detail. Price's laugh was sharp and humorless. Study hard. Right. Let me tell you what I think, Brennan. I think you're running some kind of game. I think you've got training you're not telling us about, experience that doesn't show up in your official record. And I think you're here for reasons that have nothing to do with serving your country. The words hit closer to home than Casey was comfortable with, but she kept her expression neutral. I'm here to serve, sir. Same as everyone else. Same as everyone else. Price leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. Everyone else didn't show up knowing advanced tactical procedures they shouldn't have learned yet. Everyone else doesn't move like they've been in combat before. And everyone else doesn't have that look in their eyes. What look is that, sir? The look of someone who's seen people die. Real death, not training exercises or war movies. The kind of death that changes you forever. Casey felt something cold settle in her stomach. Price was getting too close to the truth, asking questions that had answers she couldn't give. Behind her carefully constructed cover story lay 18 months of classified operations, 6 dead teammates, and a conspiracy that reached high enough into the military hierarchy to make everyone a potential enemy. I don't know what you mean, sir. Price closed the file with a snap that seemed to echo in the small room. Here's what's going to happen, Brennan. I'm recommending you for immediate discharge from this program. Suspicion of fraudulent enlistment, possible security concerns, failure to provide accurate background information. The words hit Casey like physical blows. Discharge meant the end of her investigation, the end of any chance she had to find the person responsible for her team's death. It meant 6 good soldiers had died for nothing, their sacrifice meaningless in the face of bureaucratic suspicion and her own inability to maintain her cover. Sir, I request the opportunity to address these concerns through proper channels. You'll have that opportunity in about 6 hours when Commander Sullivan reviews my recommendation and signs off on your discharge papers. Casey stood up, her movements sharp with barely controlled frustration. The butterfly tattoo felt like it was burning against her skin, a reminder of promises made and debts unpaid. She could reveal the truth, could show Price exactly who she was and why she was here. But that would compromise the entire operation, would alert the conspirators that they were being hunted. Is there anything else, sir? Price watched her for a long moment, something like regret flickering in his eyes. For what it's worth, Brennan, you would have made a hell of a soldier. Whatever game you're playing, whoever you really are, you've got skills that can't be taught. It's a shame they're going to be wasted. Casey walked out of the briefing room, knowing that she had perhaps 6 hours to find another way forward. 6 hours before her carefully constructed mission fell apart completely. Behind her, Logan Price sat staring at her personnel file, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his military career. The discharge hearing was scheduled in Commander Sullivan's office, a sterile administrative space where military careers came to die with paperwork and official stamps. Casey arrived 10 minutes early, her uniform pressed to perfection, her bearing ramrod straight, despite the knowledge that her mission was about to end in failure. Blake Harrison stood outside the commander's office with 2 other recruits who'd been called as witnesses to her suspicious behavior. His satisfaction was barely concealed behind a mask of military correctness, but Casey could see the triumph in his eyes. He'd won. The princess with the butterfly tattoo was finally going to get what she deserved. Commander Brooks Sullivan was exactly what Central Casting would have ordered for a military administrative officer. Gray-haired, stern-faced, and possessed of the kind of bureaucratic ruthlessness that could end careers with a signature. He reviewed Casey's file with the same expression he might have used to examine a requisition for office supplies. Recruit Brennan, Sullivan began without looking up. You stand accused of providing false information during your enlistment process. demonstrating knowledge and skills inconsistent with your stated background, and raising security concerns regarding your true identity and motivations. The charges were read with mechanical precision, each one another nail in the coffin of her cover story. Casey listened without expression, her mind racing through increasingly desperate alternatives. She could contact her handler, could break cover and reveal the true nature of her mission, but that would end the investigation just as surely as discharge would, and the person who'd killed her team would remain free to strike again. How do you respond to these charges? Casey opened her mouth to deliver the denial she'd prepared, the carefully worded response that would at least preserve her dignity, if not her mission. But before she could speak, a sound from outside the office made her blood freeze. Helicopter rotors, close and getting closer. Her reaction was instantaneous and damning. Every muscle in her body tensed as combat instincts took over, her eyes automatically scanning the room for cover and exit routes. It was the same response Austin Rodriguez had witnessed on the obstacle course, the same trained reflex that no amount of acting could fake. Sullivan noticed, of course. His eyebrows climbed toward his hairline as he watched Casey's transformation from nervous recruit to coiled predator. Interesting reaction, Brennan. Most people don't go into combat mode when they hear training helicopters. The helicopter sound grew louder, and Casey realized with growing horror that this wasn't a training exercise. The rotors had the distinctive pitch of a military transport, and it was coming in fast and low in a way that suggested urgency rather than routine operations. Through the office window, she could see personnel scrambling across the parade ground, their movements sharp with purpose rather than the casual efficiency of daily operations. Something was happening, something that required immediate response from someone with real authority, someone like the officer Casey had been before she'd sacrificed her career to save her team. What do you think will happen when that helicopter lands? Will Casey's secret finally be exposed? Or is there another twist waiting in the wings? Drop your predictions in the comments below. The helicopter touched down on Fort Davidson's parade ground with the kind of precision that spoke of experienced pilots and urgent missions. Through Commander Sullivan's window, Casey watched figures emerge from the aircraft, their movements sharp with military authority. Even at a distance, she could make out the distinctive bearing of special operations personnel, the kind of soldiers who didn't waste time with bureaucracy when lives were on the line. Sullivan's attention was divided between the unexpected arrival outside and the discharge hearing in progress. But Casey's focus was entirely on the approaching figures. Something about the way they moved, the purposeful stride across the parade ground, sent warning signals through every instinct she'd developed over years of covert operations. One of the figures detached from the group and headed directly for the administrative building. Casey couldn't make out details at this distance, but she could see enough to know that whoever was coming carried themselves with the kind of authority that made commanders nervous and recruits disappear. "Sir," Blake Harrison interrupted, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "Shouldn't we continue with the hearing? I have testimony about Brennan's suspicious activities." Sullivan held up a hand for silence, his attention focused on the commotion outside. "In a moment, Harrison. It appears we have unexpected visitors." The footsteps in the hallway outside were measured and deliberate, the sound of someone who didn't need to announce their arrival because their presence did it for them. Casey felt the butterfly tattoo against her collarbone, its weight suddenly overwhelming, as possibilities she'd tried not to consider began crystallizing into terrifying reality. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered was tall, weathered, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command. His uniform was regulation perfect, but bore the subtle modifications that marked special operations personnel. Most importantly, His eyes swept the room with the calculating assessment of a professional soldier evaluating potential threats. Those eyes lingered on Casey for just a moment too long. "Commander Sullivan," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made the room's atmosphere change immediately. "Colonel Reed Ashworth, Special Operations Command. I need to speak with you about a security matter." Sullivan stood immediately, his bureaucratic confidence evaporating in the face of Special Operations Authority. "Of course, Colonel. We were just conducting a discharge hearing for one of our recruits. Administrative matter." Ashworth's gaze shifted to Casey again, and this time she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. Recognition, not of her face necessarily, but of something deeper, something that connected to the butterfly tattoo hidden beneath her uniform and the classified operations that weren't supposed to exist. "A discharge hearing," Ashworth repeated, his tone neutral, but somehow threatening. "What are the charges?" Blake Harrison stepped forward eagerly, sensing an opportunity to present his case to higher authority. "Sir, the recruit has demonstrated knowledge and skills far beyond her stated background. We believe she's provided false information during enlistment, possibly for security-related reasons." "Suspicious skills," Ashworth mused, his eyes never leaving Casey's face. "What kind of skills?" "Advanced mechanical knowledge, sir. Tactical awareness beyond training level. Combat reflexes that suggest prior military experience she hasn't declared." Something shifted in Ashworth's expression, a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested Blake Harrison had just said something very interesting. Casey felt the walls closing in around her, felt the carefully constructed cover story she'd built over months of preparation, beginning to crumble under scrutiny she couldn't deflect. "Combat reflexes," Ashworth repeated. "Interesting. Recruit, what's your name?" "Brennan, sir. Casey Brennan." The name hung in the air between them, and Casey watched Ashworth's face for any sign that he recognized it from classified reports or operational briefings. His expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away. "Brennan," he said slowly, as if testing the sound of it. "And you're here for discharge due to security concerns?" "Yes, sir." Ashworth walked closer, his movements casual, but somehow predatory. Casey felt every instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something other than stand there while her world collapsed around her. But she held her position, maintained her cover, even as she felt the butterfly tattoo burning against her collarbone like a brand. "Tell me about the butterfly," Ashworth said quietly. The words hit Casey like a physical blow. Around the room, faces turned toward her with sudden interest, but she barely noticed them. All of her attention was focused on the man standing 3 feet away, the man who somehow knew about the tattoo hidden beneath her uniform. "Sir?" "The butterfly tattoo on your left collarbone. Tell me about it." The silence in the room was complete and terrifying. Blake Harrison's face showed confusion and growing excitement as he realized this special operations officer was about to expose Casey's secrets more thoroughly than he could have hoped. Commander Sullivan leaned forward in his chair, suddenly very interested in a discharge hearing that had seemed routine minutes earlier. Casey felt the weight of 6 dead teammates, felt the pressure of 18 months of hunting their killer, felt everything she'd sacrificed to get this far, hanging in the balance of whatever came next. "I don't know what you mean, sir." Ashworth smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Major Casey Brennan," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Operation Desert Phoenix. Task Force Shadow 6 KIA. 1 survivor. Congressional Medal of Honor nomination. Withdrawn due to classified circumstances. The room exploded into shocked silence. Blake Harrison's mouth hung open like he'd been physically struck. Commander Sullivan half rose from his chair, his face pale with the realization that he'd been about to discharge someone whose real service record was buried so deep in classified files that even he'd never seen it. Casey stood perfectly still as her carefully constructed world collapsed around her, as months of preparation and cover story development crumbled under the weight of recognition she'd hoped would never come. The butterfly tattoo felt like it was on fire against her collarbone, a reminder of promises made and prices paid by soldiers who'd trusted her with their lives. Now those same lives, those same sacrifices, had become the instrument of her exposure. Ashworth continued to study her with eyes that missed nothing, that cataloged every micro-expression and defensive posture. The question isn't whether you belong in this discharge hearing, Major. The question is what the hell you're doing here in the first place. The silence in Commander Sullivan's office stretched like a wire under tension, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Casey stood frozen as her carefully constructed world crumbled around her, every instinct screaming conflicting commands. Run, fight, maintain cover, break cover, trust, don't trust. The butterfly tattoo burned against her collarbone, like a reminder of choices that had led her to this moment. Colonel Ashworth circled her slowly, his movements predatory and calculating. "Major Casey Brennan," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, officially retired due to medical complications following classified operations in the Middle East. Unofficially," he paused directly in front of her, "that's what I'm here to find out." Blake Harrison found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Major, sir, there must be some mistake. She's just a recruit. She has no military background according to her file." Ashworth's laugh was cold and sharp. "Her file. Right. Tell me, Harrison, what do you know about black operations? About missions so classified that the people who run them don't officially exist? About soldiers who sacrifice everything, including their own identities, to protect national security?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sullivan had sunk back into his chair, his face pale with the realization that he'd been about to discharge someone whose real service record was buried deeper than most state secrets. Blake Harrison looked like he might be sick, the color draining from his face as the implications of months of harassment began to sink in. Casey remained silent, her training warring with desperation. Ashworth knew who she was, but how much did he know about why she was here? Was he friend or enemy, part of the conspiracy she was hunting, or someone who could help her complete her mission? Every word she spoke from this point forward could either save or damn everything she'd worked for. "Nothing to say, Major?" Ashworth asked, his tone deceptively casual. "No explanations for why a decorated combat veteran is playing games with recruit training? No justification for the months of deception?" Before Casey could respond, a knock at the door interrupted the tense standoff. Sullivan called for entry, his voice barely steady, and Harper Coleman stepped into the room. The young recruit's eyes immediately found Casey, and something in her expression suggested she'd been listening outside the door long enough to understand the situation. "Sir," Harper addressed Sullivan, though her attention remained focused on Casey, "I was told there was testimony needed regarding recruit Brennan's performance and conduct." "That won't be necessary now," Sullivan began, but Ashworth held up a hand to stop him. "Actually, I'd like to hear what Recruit Coleman has to say. Her perspective might be illuminating." Harper stepped forward with the same quiet confidence she'd shown throughout training, her presence somehow steadying in the chaos of revelations and accusations. "Sir, I've observed Casey Brennan for 2 weeks of intensive training. I've seen her performance under pressure, her conduct under stress, and her response to harassment and sabotage. Blake Harrison shifted uncomfortably, the word sabotage hitting him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to object, but Ashworth's cold stare silenced him before he could speak. Continue, Coleman. Sir, whatever her background, whatever her reasons for being here, she's conducted herself with honor. She's been subjected to treatment that would have broken most recruits, harassment that crossed every line of military conduct, and deliberate sabotage of her equipment and evaluations. Through all of it, she never retaliated, never complained, never broke protocol. Harper's voice grew stronger as she continued, her words carrying the weight of witnessed truth. If she's been hiding something, sir, it wasn't to gain unfair advantage. It was to blend in, to avoid standing out, to complete whatever mission brought her here without drawing attention to herself. The skills she's demonstrated aren't the skills of someone trying to show off. They're the skills of someone trying very hard not to. Ashworth listened to Harper's testimony with growing interest, his eyes never leaving Casey's face. When Harper finished, he nodded slowly, as if her words had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Thank you, Coleman. Your testimony is noted. He turned back to Casey, his expression unreadable. You've been protecting something, Major. The question is what, and whether it's worth the lives that might depend on it. The weight of those words settled over Casey like a shroud. Lives that might depend on it. She thought of her 6 dead teammates, of the conspiracy that had killed them, of the investigation that had brought her here in disguise. She thought of the other bases Harper had mentioned, the pattern of harassment and security breaches that suggested something larger and more dangerous than anyone realized. Sir, she said quietly, her voice carrying the formal tone of an officer addressing a superior, I request permission to speak privately with you about classified matters. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Sullivan, clear the room. This conversation is now classified at the highest levels. Sir, Blake Harrison protested, we have a right to know what's going on. We've been training with someone who's been lying to us for weeks. Ashworth's attention shifted to Blake with the sudden, focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. You have the right to remain silent, Harrison. I suggest you exercise it. Coleman, you too, outside now. As the room emptied, leaving only Casey, Ashworth, and Sullivan, the atmosphere changed yet again. The bureaucratic formality of a discharge hearing had given way to something far more serious, far more dangerous. Commander Sullivan, Ashworth said, without taking his eyes off Casey. What I'm about to tell you is classified at compartmentalized levels. You will not discuss it with anyone. You will not include it in any reports, and you will not acknowledge this conversation ever happened. Understood. Sullivan nodded mutely, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Ashworth turned his full attention to Casey, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart race. Not hostility, but recognition. The kind of recognition that came from shared experiences, shared sacrifices, shared understanding of costs that civilian minds couldn't comprehend. 18 months ago, he began, his voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Task Force Shadow conducted a classified operation to extract high-value intelligence assets from a compromised position in hostile territory. The mission was betrayed from within. 6 soldiers died. 1 survived, but only because she sacrificed her career, her identity, and her future to get critical intelligence home. Casey felt the butterfly tattoo burning against her collarbone as Ashworth recounted the nightmare that had destroyed her life and brought her to this moment. The survivor was Major Casey Brennan, awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in a closed ceremony, then officially retired due to medical complications. Unofficially, she was recruited for a deep-cover investigation into the security breach that killed her team, an investigation that led her here to Fort Davidson, hunting the same conspiracy that murdered 6 American soldiers. Sullivan's face had gone completely white. "Sir, are you saying that Recruit Brennan is actually an undercover investigator?" "I'm saying," Ashworth replied, still watching Casey, "that Major Brennan has been conducting a classified counterintelligence operation while everyone in this room has been treating her like a security risk and a fraud." The words hit Blake Harrison's accusations like a sledgehammer, shattering months of assumptions and revealing the true scope of what had been happening at Fort Davidson. Casey had endured harassment, sabotage, and humiliation, not because she was weak or fraudulent, but because she was hunting a conspiracy that reached high enough into the military hierarchy to compromise classified operations. Ashworth stepped closer to Casey, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The question, Major, is whether your investigation has been compromised by this exposure, whether we can still use your cover to complete the mission." Casey met his gaze steadily, feeling the weight of decision settling over her like armor. "Sir, the harassment and scrutiny were getting worse anyway. My cover was becoming harder to maintain. If anything, this exposure might provide an opportunity to move to the next phase, which is—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sir, I've identified 3 potential suspects within the Fort Davidson command structure. Personnel with access to the kind of classified information that was leaked to compromise Operation Desert Phoenix. The investigation needs to move from passive observation to active interrogation." Ashworth nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like electric current. "And you'll need backup for that phase. Official support instead of operating alone." "Yes, sir." Sullivan cleared his throat nervously, still struggling to process the transformation of a routine discharge hearing into a classified counterintelligence briefing. "Sir, what about the other recruits? Harrison and the others who witnessed this conversation?" Ashworth's expression grew cold. "Harrison and his friends will be transferred immediately to different facilities. Separate assignments, non-disclosure agreements, and enough distance to prevent them from comparing notes about what they've seen here." The casual efficiency with which he dismantled the lives of people who'd made themselves problems was both impressive and terrifying. Casey recognized the ruthless pragmatism of special operations, where mission success trumped individual concerns, and security took precedence over personal feelings. "Sir," she said quietly, "there's something else. The pattern of harassment I experienced here, the systematic targeting and sabotage, it matches reports I've received from other installations. This conspiracy may be larger than we initially suspected." Ashworth's attention sharpened like a blade. "How much larger?" "At least 6 other facilities, sir. All showing the same pattern of infiltration, all compromising personnel with backgrounds similar to mine. It's not just about Operation Desert Phoenix anymore. It's about a systematic effort to identify and eliminate deep-cover operatives throughout the special operations community." The implications of her words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. If Casey was right, if the conspiracy extended beyond a single betrayed mission, then the national security implications were staggering. Every special operation, every classified mission, every deep cover agent could be at risk. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and implications. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that would affect lives across multiple theaters of operation. "Major, your investigation just became a priority operation. Full support, unlimited resources, direct reporting to my command." He paused, his eyes finding the outline of the butterfly tattoo beneath her uniform. Show me. Casey hesitated for just a moment, then unbuttoned the top of her uniform enough to reveal the full butterfly tattoo on her collarbone. The intricate black ink seemed to come alive in the office lighting, its wings spread wide as if frozen in flight. But it was the details that made Ashworth's breath catch. The tiny names worked into the wing patterns, the date hidden in the body design, the 6 small stars that marked the butterfly's antenna. Jesus, Sullivan whispered, seeing the tattoo clearly for the first time. It's a memorial. 6 good soldiers, Casey said quietly, her fingers tracing the butterfly's wings with automatic reverence. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Sergeant First Class David Kim, Specialist Janet Rodriguez, Corporal Marcus Williams, Private First Class Amanda Chen, Private Thomas Anderson. They died trusting me to bring them home. Ashworth stared at the tattoo for a long moment, and when he looked up, his eyes held the kind of respect reserved for soldiers who'd proven themselves under fire. Without warning, without fanfare, he came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the formal respect due a superior officer, "it's an honor to serve with you." The gesture sent shock waves through the room. Sullivan scrambled to his feet and added his own salute, suddenly understanding that he was in the presence of someone whose service record existed at classification levels he'd never even heard of. Outside the office, Casey could hear movement as other personnel responded to the sight of a colonel saluting someone they'd thought was just a problem recruit. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. In the space of a heartbeat, Casey went from suspected fraud to respected superior officer, from a problem to be solved to a mission commander to be supported. The butterfly tattoo, which had been a source of mockery and derision, was revealed as a sacred memorial to fallen heroes. But even as she accepted the salutes and recognition, Casey's mind was already moving to the next phase of her investigation. The exposure of her true identity changed everything, opened new possibilities while closing others. She could operate openly now, but that also meant her enemies would know she was coming. "Sir," she said to Ashworth, "I need immediate access to personnel files for 3 individuals: Instructor Logan Price, Administrative Specialist Jennifer Walsh, and Supply Sergeant Robert Chen. All 3 have had access to classified information that could have compromised operations beyond Desert Phoenix." Ashworth nodded curtly. "You'll have full access within the hour. What else do you need?" "Communication with other installations where similar patterns have been identified. If this is a coordinated effort, we need to move simultaneously to prevent the conspiracy from adapting to our investigation." "Agreed. I'll establish secure channels immediately." As they spoke, Casey could hear commotion building outside the office. Word was spreading through Fort Davidson with the lightning speed that characterized military gossip. But this time, the story was different. Instead of whispers about a suspicious recruit, personnel were learning that they'd been in the presence of a decorated combat veteran whose service record was classified at the highest levels. The consequences were already cascading through the facility's hierarchy, like dominoes falling in precise sequence. Blake Harrison and his followers faced immediate disciplinary action for harassment of a superior officer. Austin Rodriguez found himself promoted to squad leader in recognition of his observational skills and professional conduct. Harper Coleman received a commendation for her testimony and integrity under pressure. But the real changes went deeper than individual punishments and rewards. Fort Davidson's training protocols were under immediate review, its security procedures being overhauled, and its command structure being scrutinized for signs of the same conspiracy that had infiltrated other installations. "Major," Ashworth said, his voice carrying the weight of operational authority, "I need you to understand something. What you've uncovered here, the scope of what we're dealing with, it goes beyond revenge for your fallen teammates. This is about the integrity of special operations across all branches of service. Casey nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the butterfly tattoo. I understand, sir, but those 6 soldiers are still the reason I'm here. They deserve justice, and I intend to get it for them. They'll get it, Ashworth promised, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of command. All of them, and so will every other soldier who's been compromised by this conspiracy. The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with the gravity of missions yet to come and enemies yet to be identified. Casey felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she'd carried for 18 months finally beginning to ease. She wasn't alone anymore. The butterfly tattoo no longer marked her as different or suspicious, but as someone who'd earned the right to hunt the people responsible for betraying American soldiers. Outside Commander Sullivan's office, Fort Davidson was transforming itself around the revelation of Casey's true identity. Training schedules were being revised, security protocols updated, and personnel files reviewed for signs of infiltration. The facility that had spent weeks trying to expel her was now reorganizing itself to support her mission. But the most significant changes were happening in the minds of the people who'd witnessed her journey from suspected fraud to revealed hero. Blake Harrison sat in disciplinary holding, replaying every cruel word and hostile action with growing horror at what he'd done. Austin Rodriguez was writing a detailed report about every suspicious incident he'd witnessed, his observational skills finally finding their proper purpose. Harper Coleman was being briefed on her new role as liaison between Casey's investigation and the facility's regular operations. The butterfly tattoo that had marked Casey as different, as other, as someone who didn't belong in their world, was revealed as a sacred memorial to soldiers who died in service to something larger than themselves. The mockery and derision it had inspired were transformed into respect and reverence, the laughter into silence heavy with understanding. 3 days after the revelation in Commander Sullivan's office, Casey stood in the same tank maintenance bay where her unusual skills had first attracted suspicion. But instead of working alone, while others whispered about her background, she was surrounded by personnel eager to learn from her experience and contribute to her investigation. The butterfly tattoo was no longer hidden beneath her uniform. She wore it openly now, a visible reminder of the price of service and the weight of command. When new recruits arrived at Fort Davidson, they were briefed on her story as part of their orientation, learning that true warriors sometimes fought their battles in silence and shadow. But Casey's attention wasn't focused on the changes around her. It was concentrated on the secure communication terminal that had been installed in her new office, the encrypted channels that connected her investigation to similar operations at installations across the country. The pattern she'd identified at Fort Davidson was repeating itself at Fort Bragg, Camp Pendleton, and 4 other facilities. The conspiracy that had killed her teammates was larger and more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Ma'am, Harper Coleman approached with an encrypted message folder. Priority communication from Colonel Ashworth. Casey opened the folder and read its contents with growing concern. 3 more installations had reported security breaches. 2 more deep cover operatives had been compromised. The enemy was adapting to their investigation, moving faster and more aggressively to eliminate threats to their operation. Coleman, she said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. How quickly can we assemble a briefing team for Operation Butterfly Effect? Within 2 hours, ma'am. All personnel have been standing by for your orders. Casey nodded, feeling the familiar weight of command settling over her shoulders. The butterfly tattoo pressed against her collarbone, a reminder of the 6 soldiers who'd trusted her with their lives and the many more who were counting on her now. 2 hours then, full briefing, complete operational parameters, and preparation for immediate deployment. She paused, looking around the facility that had tried to break her, and ended up revealing her true purpose. It's time to finish what they started. As Harper hurried away to make preparations, Casey touched the butterfly tattoo one final time. The memorial to her fallen teammates had become a symbol of transformation, of the way suffering and sacrifice could be reborn as purpose and strength. The soldiers who died in the ambush that destroyed Task Force Shadow had given her more than just a reason for revenge. They'd given her the strength to endure months of harassment and suspicion while hunting their killers. Now that hunt was entering its final phase, moving from the shadows into open warfare against an enemy that had underestimated the determination of a woman who carried her dead teammates' names in ink and carried their memory in every action she took. The butterfly tattoo had been mocked as decoration, as feminine weakness in a masculine world. But butterflies were symbols of transformation, of metamorphosis, of creatures that emerged from cocoons stronger and more beautiful than they'd been before. Casey had entered her cocoon as Major Casey Brennan, decorated combat veteran. She was emerging as something new and infinitely more dangerous. The strongest warriors hide their scars behind butterflies, but when the time comes to fight, those butterflies become wings that carry them into battle. The secure briefing room at Fort Davidson hummed with tension as Casey prepared to address the assembled personnel. Maps covered every wall, communication equipment lined every table, and classified folders stacked the central conference table like ammunition waiting to be deployed. The butterfly tattoo on her collarbone caught the fluorescent lighting, its wings seeming to move in the artificial glare. Colonel Ashworth stood at the head of the table, his expression carrying the weight of operational command. Around him, a dozen specialists from various fields waited for briefings that would determine the course of their next several months. Casey recognized the atmosphere immediately. It was the same focused energy that had preceded every major operation of her career, the same mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied missions where success and failure were measured in lives rather than statistics. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ashworth began, his voice cutting through the room's ambient noise like a blade. "Operation Butterfly Effect is now active. Major Brennan will brief you on the scope and parameters of our mission." Casey stepped forward, feeling the familiar weight of command settling over her shoulders like a well-worn coat. The harassment and suspicion of the past weeks had stripped away everything extraneous, leaving only the essential core of who she was, a soldier with a mission and the skills to complete it. 6 installations across 4 states, she began, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd done their homework. 12 compromised operatives, 37 security breaches over 18 months, all connected to a conspiracy that reaches high enough into our command structure to compromise classified operations before they begin. The numbers landed like physical blows. Several personnel shifted uncomfortably as the scope of the threat became clear. This wasn't about a single betrayed mission or an isolated security failure. This was about systematic infiltration of special operations at the highest levels. "The pattern is consistent," Casey continued, activating a wall-mounted display that showed locations, dates, and personnel connections. Highly skilled operatives are inserted into regular training environments with undercover identities. They're systematically harassed, sabotaged, and ultimately exposed by coordinated efforts that appear to be coincidental, but follow identical scripts across multiple installations. Harper Coleman, who'd been promoted to intelligence liaison for the operation, raised her hand. "Ma'am, are you suggesting that the harassment you experienced here was orchestrated by enemy agents?" "I'm stating it as fact," Casey replied, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Blake Harrison, Austin Rodriguez, and 4 other personnel received outside guidance on how to pressure and expose me. The techniques they used, the specific methods of sabotage, the escalation patterns. All of it matches operations conducted at the other compromised installations. The implications were staggering. Every cruel word, every act of sabotage, every moment of harassment had been part of a coordinated intelligence operation designed to identify and eliminate deep cover agents. The personal cruelty Casey had endured was revealed as professional espionage of the highest order. "Sir," one of the communications specialists asked Ashworth, "how do we know our current operations aren't already compromised? If they can orchestrate harassment campaigns across multiple installations, what's to stop them from infiltrating this briefing?" Ashworth's smile was cold and sharp. Because Major Brennan's exposure wasn't part of their plan. They expected her to break under pressure or be discharged in disgrace. Instead, she maintained her cover long enough to identify their methods and personnel. "We're operating with intelligence they don't know we possess." Casey activated another display, this one showing personnel files and communication intercepts. "We've identified 17 individuals across the 6 installations who were involved in harassment campaigns against deep cover operatives. 14 of them have since been transferred to positions with access to classified operational intelligence. 3 have disappeared entirely." The systematic nature of the conspiracy was becoming clear. It wasn't enough to expose deep cover agents. The enemy was also positioning their own people to intercept and compromise future operations. The scale of the infiltration was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. "Ma'am," Harper asked, "what's our primary objective? Arrest the conspirators or gather intelligence on their broader network?" Casey looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person who would be risking their lives in the operation to come. "Both. We're going to roll up their entire network, starting with the personnel we've identified, and working our way up the chain of command until we reach whoever ordered the death of my teammates." The promise carried the weight of 18 months of careful investigation and personal sacrifice. The butterfly tattoo pressed against her collarbone, a reminder of the 6 soldiers whose deaths had started this hunt, and whose memory would see it through to completion. "Operation Butterfly Effect will deploy in 3 phases, Ashworth announced, taking control of the briefing. Phase 1. Simultaneous arrests at all 6 installations of identified enemy agents. Phase 2. Interrogation and intelligence gathering to identify higher-level conspirators. Phase 3. Systematic elimination of the entire network. Casey felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same mixture of anticipation and resolve that had carried her through every dangerous mission of her career. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for mission success or national security. She was fighting for the memory of 6 soldiers who trusted her with their lives and the promise she'd made to bring their killers to justice. "Questions?" Ashworth asked. The briefing room was silent for a moment. Then Harper raised her hand. "Ma'am, permission to request assignment to your personal team for the operation?" Casey looked at the young soldier who'd provided testimony when everyone else had been ready to accept her discharge, who'd recognized integrity even when it was hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. "Granted. Anyone else?" One by one, every person in the briefing room volunteered for direct assignment to her team, not because they were ordered to, not because careers depended on it, but because they understood what the butterfly tattoo represented and wanted to be part of finishing what had been started in a desert ambush 18 months ago. As the briefing concluded and personnel began preparing for deployment, Casey remained in the conference room with Colonel Ashworth. The maps and classified folders surrounded them like artifacts from a war that was finally moving into its decisive phase. "Major," Ashworth said quietly. I need you to understand something. When this operation concludes, when we've eliminated this conspiracy, there won't be any parades or commendations. The classification levels involved mean that most of what you've accomplished will never be publicly acknowledged. Casey traced the butterfly tattoo with one finger, feeling the weight of names and memories embedded in its wings. Sir, the only acknowledgement I need is knowing that 6 good soldiers can finally rest in peace. Everything else is secondary. Ashworth nodded, understanding passing between them like electric current. They chose well when they chose you to lead them. All of them did. The words carried the weight of professional respect and personal recognition that Casey had been seeking since the day her teammates died in an ambush that should never have happened. Not vindication for her actions, not justification for her sacrifices, but simple acknowledgement that she'd been worthy of the trust placed in her by soldiers who'd given their lives in service to something larger than themselves. 2 hours later, encrypted communications were transmitted to installations across the country. Operation Butterfly Effect was active, moving from planning to execution with the precision that characterized special operations at their best. At Fort Bragg, teams prepared to move on 3 identified targets. At Camp Pendleton, surveillance units activated monitoring equipment that had been positioned weeks in advance. At Norfolk Naval Base, counterintelligence specialists reviewed final mission parameters while checking equipment that would determine the success or failure of 18 months of careful investigation. Casey stood in Fort Davidson's command center, watching real-time feeds from 6 different installations as the largest counterintelligence operation in recent military history prepared to unfold. The butterfly tattoo pressed against her collarbone, its weight familiar now, a constant reminder of the soldiers whose deaths had made this moment possible. She thought of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who died covering their withdrawal from the ambush, of Specialist Janet Rodriguez, who'd used her last breath to radio coordinates that saved Casey's life, of Private Thomas Anderson, barely 19 years old, who'd thrown himself on a grenade that never should have been there if their mission hadn't been betrayed from within. Ma'am, Harper Coleman approached with another encrypted update. All teams report ready status. We're synchronized across all 6 installations. The scope of what they were attempting was unprecedented. Simultaneous arrests of 17 suspected enemy agents, coordinated searches of 34 locations, and the activation of surveillance protocols that would monitor hundreds of communications channels for signs of the conspiracy's higher-level command structure. One mistake, one compromised communication, one agent who escaped the net could unravel everything they'd built. But Casey felt a calm settling over her like armor, the same focused serenity that had carried her through every dangerous mission of her career. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd sacrificed everything to achieve. The harassment and humiliation of the past weeks, the months of maintaining a false identity and enduring suspicion, all of it had led to this moment when justice would finally be served to those who'd betrayed American soldiers. Colonel Ashworth moved beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Major, in 30 seconds, we'll initiate the largest simultaneous arrest operation in Special Operations history. Are you ready? Casey touched the butterfly tattoo one final time, feeling the names of her fallen teammates written in its wings, carrying their memory into whatever came next. Sir, I've been ready for 18 months. The conspiracy that had killed Casey's teammates and compromised dozens of other operations was about to discover that their systematic elimination of deep cover agents had missed one crucial target. The woman with the butterfly tattoo had survived their efforts to expose and eliminate her. Now she was coming for them, carrying the memory of 6 dead soldiers, and the promise of justice that had sustained her through 18 months of hunting in shadow and silence. The strongest warriors hide their scars behind butterflies. But when the time comes for justice, those butterflies become wings that carry truth into battle against those who thought they could murder American soldiers without consequence. The war that had begun with betrayal in a distant desert was finally entering its final phase, and Major Casey Brennan intended to finish it. In the gripping tale of Casey Brennan, a seemingly ordinary recruit with a delicate butterfly tattoo, we uncover a profound life lesson that resonates deeply in our everyday world. Never judge someone's strength by their outward appearance, for true resilience often hides behind the most unassuming facades. Casey's story is a heart-wrenching reminder of the invisible battles many fight in silence. Mocked and sabotaged for her pretty decoration, she endured humiliation and doubt. Her tattoo, a memorial to 6 fallen comrades who died screaming her name in a classified hell, becoming a symbol of unspoken sacrifice. Yet, beneath that fragile ink lay a decorated major, a survivor of betrayal and loss, who channeled her grief into unyielding determination. This narrative tugs at the soul, evoking tears for the unsung heroes among us. The single parent juggling jobs while hiding exhaustion, the quiet colleague battling inner demons, or the friend whose smile conceals profound pain. It teaches us empathy in a judgmental society, how a simple act of kindness could uncover worlds of courage we never imagined. Casey's journey from ridiculed princess to saluted commander stirs raw emotions, inspiring us to reflect on our own prejudices and the power of perseverance. In real life, like Casey, we all carry scars that shape us into butterflies, emerging stronger from cocoons of adversity. Her triumph urges us to honor hidden stories, fostering compassion that heals divides. What hidden strength have you discovered in yourself or others? Share your emotional takeaways in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone today. If this tale moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more incredible stories of silent warriors. Let's build a community that celebrates resilience together. 278 words.